So good morning, everybody. I thought Opar was going to introduce everybody else and leave me out in the cold. So I kind of scraped in as the last person to be introduced. I think Opar made it clear, over the last few years, individuals from these different associations, all of us active in the events and audiovisual sector, have put aside our differences to work on the development of an industry-specific BEE scorecard for our sector. Some of these organizations represent individuals and some of them represent companies. Some of them think the proposals that we've put forward so far go too far, and others believe that they don't go far enough. But despite those differences, and we've had some very fierce battles between us over the last 10 years, we've finally agreed on a document that we all feel comfortable with. We've sent it out to our stakeholders for comment and input. We've processed the inputs that we've received so far, so the version of the document that you have in front of you is an amended version that's been updated from our previous industry engagements. And we believe that with your input, we've been able to collectively develop a draft scorecard that will really serve our sector and make a difference to the people working in it. The next step in the process is that the document is scheduled to be published in the Government Gazette in the very near future. We were hoping that it would be published in the Gazette in the last week. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but it is imminent. And it'll then be open for a period of 3 months, and at the end of that 3-month period, we'll again collate inputs that have been received from our public engagement forums. We'll update the document. There'll be a final version that is published in the Government Gazette, and that document will then become law, and the elements that are embedded within it will be binding on all employers that are working in the events, technical and production services sector. So this is, I think, our second presentation live in Cape Town. We're embarking on a roadshow that will take in the rest of the country. We've had several virtual webinars, and as I said, people have provided us with their feedback. The current draft is far from perfect, and there are several things that we have not addressed. For example, we've specifically, and it has been raised recently, we haven't addressed the issue of special purpose commercial vehicles often used in the film and audiovisual industry to mitigate risk and to ring fence income and expenditure. These are organizations that are established for a specific purpose. They exist for the duration of that particular purpose, and once that purpose has been achieved, they are dissolved. It's not probably that much of an issue outside of the film and television industry, but it is a model that works in the events industry in Europe, and going forward it's very likely that it'll be one of the things that becomes popular in South Africa. We also need to figure out how we can develop a fund that will drive this transformation process and ensure that black-owned businesses are able to access the funds they need to grow their business and to truly transform the sector. One of the questions I've been asked since we started our public engagements, and particularly since we started this rollout in a post-COVID world, is why we need a scorecard. And particularly now when the events and the audiovisual industry have been completely decimated by the impact of the COVID pandemic. And the answer is provided by a quote from the Minister of Sport, Arts and Culture, our host today, even if he's not here, represented by Colin. And he described how one of the challenges facing the department is the disintegrated nature of what people are doing, because they come from different genres, different race groups. People actually have not been good at cooperating and collaborating with each other. And he described how social cohesion and economic transformation sat at the heart of the Arts and Culture Ministry. And he went on to describe how nation building and social cohesion would help redress the imbalances of the past and help us ensure that people who were historically excluded from the economy also, through this piece of legislation, find a fair share of participation. These comments were reinforced by President Ramaphosa, who, in presenting the South African Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, described how the pandemic itself presented an opportunity to reset the South African economy. It is an opportunity to build a new inclusive economy that benefits all South Africans, he said, and he positioned transformation and black economic empowerment high on the government's economic agenda. So much of the work that we've done, I think Opal made it clear, this process started back in 2011, and so we've now been in this process for 11 years. But a lot of the work that has led to the current draft document is work that was completed during this COVID pandemic. And it was really because of government's commitment to use the pandemic as a stimulus for economic and racial transformation that has come about. Pardon me. Since the removal of the state of national disaster, you'll have heard several politicians talk about build back better. It became a bit of a joke on national television. Everybody from the president down was using the same phraseology. But the choice is clear in the way that we do build back better. We can either embrace the generic code of good practice and drive transformation using the existing legislation, or we can develop our own industry scorecard that's specific to our needs. And in exploring whether we should develop our own scorecard or whether we should use the generic scorecard, I'd suggest that the events and the audiovisual industry is unique. Our companies tend to be much smaller. The people that work in those organizations tend to have very specialist skills. We make extensive use of the freelance community. And essentially we do so as our needs dictate, and because of that our revenues and our income and our expenses fluctuate wildly. And essentially what that adds up to is a situation in which if we apply the generic scorecard, we find that it's built for regular organizations that have substantial income and a consistent revenue stream, and in the events and audiovisual industry that simply doesn't apply. So the generic scorecard is a rudimentary tool because it's designed to be used across multiple industry sectors, and what we're trying to do is to build a tool that works specifically for our sector. Using the generic scorecard is a bit like using a pipe wrench to remove a nut from a bolt. You're falling asleep. No. Okay. Yeah, it's like using a pipe wrench to remove a nut from a bolt. It'll work. You know, it's a tool that will work. But a spanner is a far more appropriate tool. And what we're proposing is to cast a bespoke spanner that allows us to implement a transformation agenda within our industry sector that is specific to our needs. But we need for this bespoke spanner to be developed with your needs and with your inputs. The proposed scorecard covers a variety of event formats, including sport, entertainment, and business events. It includes exhibitions, incentive tours, film, television productions, audio-visual productions. It even includes events that are hosted in a virtual online space. So this experience that we're having now would classify as an online event. It's very broad in the activities that it covers. It cuts across several other industry sectors. And we are aware that in its breadth, there may be companies who are confused about where they fall. Does an event venue, for example, does that fall under the Tourism Charter Council or the Tourism Sector Code? Does a commercials producer fall under the Marketing, Advertising and Advertising Sector Code? Does a company hosting a virtual event fall under the ICT Sector Code? And I'm very pleased that Lisa's here. This is a conversation that we had with Westgrow during our last engagements. But our guideline response is simple. The Charter applies to any organisation that generates more than 50% of its revenue from the events and the audiovisual sector. We've spoken to the Tourism Charter Council, and we seem to be in agreement with them. So if you are an event venue that offers accommodation to event delegates, and 50% or more of your revenue comes from the provision of accommodation, then you would fall under the tourism codes. But if 50% of your revenue or more falls into the events sector, then you would fall into this charter that we are developing. And exactly the same applies to commercial producers that produce audiovisual content that is specific to the advertising and marketing sector. So if that's their primary market, they would still fall under the MAC sector code. But if they're producing entertainment content for radio and television broadcast, or for distribution on social media platforms or on a streaming platform, then they would be covered by this particular charter code. So, yeah, I suppose a good example would be an IT company. So if you're an IT company that provides the technology, that sells the technology that is used for a virtual streaming event, then you would fall under the ICT code. But if you are a user of that same technology, then you would fall under the ITP, what are we called? Event Technical Production Services Industry. I never do it fast. So then this is the code that would apply. In August last year, the National Film and Video Foundation released their 2021 Economic Assessment Study. And it was a survey that looked at the transformation in the audiovisual sector, and they concluded that overall there are low levels of inclusion and slow transformation in the audiovisual sector. This is a particular challenge. They identified at higher skill levels within the industry where there has been very limited transformation. They recognized that the audiovisual sector has made steady progress on the transformation front in terms of employment and management aspects, but there's been limited progress on the ownership aspect, and their report specifically highlighted the lack of self-sufficient and sustainable black-owned business enterprises. It also described how beyond the public sector, black filmmakers and producers often find it very difficult to raise capital or access the funding that they require in order to build a sustainable business. So I don't know if there are any filmmakers in the audience, but if there are, when it comes up for question time, perhaps that's an opportunity for you to comment. Similar research exists in the events industry, where we find high barriers to entry for venues and technical production companies because of the high capital cost involved. There are almost no barriers to entry for event organisers who don't require a high capital investment, but events is a high-risk business, and perhaps because it's a high-risk business, we found that there are many young people, black people, entering the industry, but a very high failure rate. So they get all excited, they pump their limited resources into building an organisation, and then 6 months later, they find themselves in a situation where they're eating baked beans and not able to run the bath at night because the water is cold. Black-owned technical production companies find it really difficult to raise capital and access private funding, and there's been a limited opportunity for training and skills development, particularly training relating to the business skills that are required for individuals wanting to explore a future in business ownership or management. In order to address those issues, we've taken a long look at the core elements of the BEE scorecard, and we've radically increased the transformation targets for ownership, management control, and skills development. We've also increased the number of points needed to achieve the various BEE levels. So while there are more points available in each category, the targets are also raised. I'm just going to share a few examples of how the proposed scorecard deviates from the generic scorecard, and a good place to start is with the ownership targets. In this instance, the target for exercisable voting rights in an entity held by black people is increased from 25% plus one voting share to 40%. Our objective here is to incentivize organizations to increase black participation in industry boards, but the reward for the higher target is increased from 4 weighting points to 10 weighting points. Have no idea what's going on there. We've also increased the targets for the economic interest in which black people are entitled from 25% in the generic scorecard to 40% in the ETPSI scorecard, again with a corresponding increase in the weighting points that accrue. We've proposed a significant increase in the targets related to the economic interest of black persons in shared ownership schemes and cooperatives, raising the target from 4% to 20%, so that we can encourage black people to embrace empowerment structures and to encourage companies to sell shares to their employees. We're looking for greater equity participation from staff and surrounding communities. One of the big concerns identified in the research carried out by the NFVF revolved around the failure of black employees to progress into middle management. They enter an organization and then they get stuck there. And so we've proposed a target to address this bottleneck and create an opportunity for junior employees to progress in their career. This target does not exist in the generic scorecard and is introduced in response to the specific challenges that exist in the film and events industry. We've also doubled targets for supplier and enterprise development, encouraging companies not only to create employment opportunities for their own staff, but also to create a black-owned supply chain that can feed into their business. We've increased the target allocated to training and skills development, specifically because we want to encourage on-the-job training, mentorship, and work-integrated learning, as well as more formal education that leads to the award of a qualification or a professional designation. And then finally, we've increased targets for socio-economic development because we believe that the events industry in particular has the potential to offer employment opportunities that feed into a much broader community. We've often seen the development of micro-enterprises that can contribute to the events and audiovisual sector, perhaps with the production of local craft products or other activities such as that. So we've tried to take a collaborative approach that takes into account other government initiatives. For example, SACWA has registered several professional designations in both the film and events industry, and we want to encourage people working in those sectors to earn a professional designation that recognizes their skill and their knowledge and their competence. We're aware that there are funding initiatives delivered through the DTIC Film Fund. We want to ensure that the work that we've been doing in the development of a scorecard supports their transformation objectives, but also that their funding policies support our objectives, particularly relating to training and skills development. We're aware that the National Convention Bureau offers programs that provide financial support to event organisers hosting events in rural communities. And again, we want to ensure that we work with the Convention Bureau's funding policy to ensure that they're aligned with our transformation agenda and vice versa. Ideally, what we are looking for is for all organs of state to be aligned in the 5 pillars of transformation, so that by working together, we can fast-track black economic empowerment in our country and create an environment that brings economic prosperity to everybody. But this vision, as grand as it is not easy to achieve. So while we've published our draft scorecard, and it is certainly a work in progress, this will be amended based on your feedback. This is your opportunity to collaborate in the development of an industry-specific scorecard that promotes a transformation agenda without throttling the economic recovery of the sector as we emerge from this COVID pandemic. We recognise that our sector has been devastated by the restrictions imposed upon us over the last 2 years. And while we're aware that many companies in the event sector have scaled down substantially to the point that they now exist only as a name on a letterhead or a sign on the outside of an empty building, it truly has been horrific. At the same time, we've seen many of our experienced technicians leave the country. More than 30% of our AV technical crew are now working in the Middle East, in Qatar, in the UAE, in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Technical crew that have made that move and are now working in the Middle East are working on interesting and groundbreaking projects that look great on a CV. They're earning hard currency in a tax-free environment, and we've no idea whether those people, having left, will ever come back. We would like to think that they will. But unless we're able to create commercial opportunities within our own industry sector that make it attractive for those people to return, the people that have left will stay away and the brain drain will continue. In that, our ability to host world-class events will evaporate, our ability to create world-class audio-visual productions will just disappear. Training is obviously part of the solution, but there's a shortage of young people entering the industry, and at a time when we need more competent people, there are less people available. So I was having a conversation earlier in the week with a colleague who works in the music industry. I won't tell you who it is, but he was commenting on the fact that so many of our event techs are now working in the Middle East, and he said, we've, as an industry sector, we've been decimated by 871 days of COVID restrictions. Our balance sheets, he said, are in disarray. 40% of people previously working in the event sector have moved on. It's hard to sell off equipment and infrastructure when the bailiff is knocking on your door. This is a reality that we all need to accept. The film industry is in a very similar situation. The British Film Institute published a skills survey back in June of this year, and they were celebrating the British production boom. The film industry in Britain and Western Europe is, it's a great place to be working at the moment. But they pointed to a looming crisis in their sector, and they suggested, the report suggested, that there was a shortage of as many as 40,000 workers in the film industry that will have arisen by 2025, with shooting schedules in the UK already affected. Now, that skills shortage in the UK is addressed in part by training programs that are taking place in the UK. But in the short term, they are actively recruiting South African crew, and again, the question is whether those crew members will ever return to South Africa, even if we build a stronger industry in this sector. So what we're looking at is an environment in which we're facing real economic challenges, and we desperately need to focus on reviving the sector in order to create a sustainable future. At the same time, we need to address historic inequality and create economic opportunity for black people. We need to promote training and skills development as a tool for economic recovery. We need to accelerate transformation at higher skill levels by creating structured career paths. We need to encourage cooperation and collaboration between established, primarily white-owned businesses and the emerging black-owned businesses that can feed in, so that we can create that environment of cooperation and collaboration and wealth building. And we need to create opportunities for black-owned businesses to access funding for CapEx and business development, because without that funding, your own growth will be thwarted. This isn't just a tick box exercise in which we pay lip service to the principles of public participation. The scorecard will impact everybody in our sector. so that whether you are a supplier or a supporter of BEE or not is completely irrelevant. You can either participate in the development of a bespoke scorecard or not. You know, we can go back to using the generic scorecard if everybody thinks that's what we should be doing, but it really will adversely impact the growth of the marketplace. So the choice is yours. You can either participate in the development of a new scorecard or you can stick with the consequences of the old one. If you'd like more information, you have copies of the scorecard here. We're going to be running a series of events around the country. The locations and the dates are up on the screen now, but we're going to be speaking to the events and audiovisual sector in every province between now and the end of, I think, the end of February. I will, you know, I'm glad that you're here. If you want more information, if you want to listen to this again, there will be a recording available on YouTube. You know, we're marketing this aggressively. We're encouraging people to provide feedback. So I look forward to hearing from you. We, as a collective, look forward to hearing from you. And this now is your opportunity. I saw lots of people making notes, so I'm going to sit down, but I want to encourage you to ask questions and engage with us so that by working together, we can create a document that is truly kind of a collaborative project. Thank you.